Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are enjoying the Congress so far. My name is Kaisa Immonen. I'm the Director of Policy at the European Patients Forum, and I have the pleasure of chairing this session. Massive amounts of data are being generated every day that could potentially be used much more to support medicine's innovation. And by that, I mean to develop new and better treatments for patients that really target their unmet needs and bring added value for the patients and for society. Whilst the randomized clinical trial remains the gold standard of evidence generation, they do have their limitations and may not always be even feasible. In addition to that, there is a growing need to understand how therapies work as they are routinely used in the real world in clinical practice. So this session focuses on the use of real-world data and big data in medicine's innovation. Real-world data, in its broadest sense, is data on the effects of healthcare interventions that isn't collected in the context of randomized clinical trials. Another definition is that it's collected in normal clinical practice. And it can be sourced from various sources, including observational studies, patient-reported outcome surveys, but also data from electronic health records, claims databases, and patient registries. Real-world evidence is evidence derived from the analysis and/or synthesis of real-world data. So hopefully data will become evidence at some point. Now, this session is not about concepts. It is about patients mainly. But still, I'm going to give you a definition of big data as well. Big data, as defined by the European Medicines Agency's Taskforce, is basically about extremely large data sets, which may be complex, multidimensional, unstructured, and heterogeneous, which are accumulating rapidly and which may be analyzed computationally to reveal patterns, trends, and associations. So one data set is not big data, but when several are linked or pooled, they can become large and complex enough to be considered big data. So real-world evidence is one source of big data, and there are, of course, others. Now, this session will zoom on to the role of patients in medicine's innovation using such data and the implications that this has for patient involvement. We will first hear from a patient representative, then from industry about how pharmaceutical companies are practically using data, and from the EU regulator to link all of this with the important regulatory and policy aspects. We will then open the floor for discussion, and hopefully you will all participate, and the session will wrap up at 3:45. For the participants, if you want to ask a question or comment, you can type it into the chat at any time. And when we open the floor to Q&A and for discussion, I will try to pick up your comments from the chat. I hope I can address all of them, but it depends on how many questions there are and how much time we will have. So without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker, and this is Dimitrios Athanasiou. Just to let you know, we have had a last-minute change today as Elizabeth Vroom from the Netherlands was going to speak, but unfortunately she's unable to join us today due to a family health issue. However, we were very lucky that our own EPF board member, Dimitrios, was able to step in at short notice. Dimitrios is a board member of the World Duchenne Organization and also a member of the Pediatric Committee of the EMA. He is also very active in Eurodis and, of course, EPF. He has set up in Greece U-Party and the patient project MDA ELAS, and he is a father of a boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I would like to thank you, Dimitrios, again very much for joining us at short notice. Your patient community is very much engaged in data, and so we very much look forward to hearing your perspective. So I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And apologies for this last minute change, but patient advocacy comes because we have patients or we are the patients. So things change. Having said that, I really want to echo what you said about the promise of real world data and big data. And the truth is that they hold the promise that we can use it properly. If we use it properly, we can develop new medicines to address patient unmet needs. But obviously with this, there are challenges and risks. And this is something that we realized very early in the process in the rare diseases. So the collection, connection, use and reuse, because at least this is the way that we want to think of the use of real world data and big data, is a constant policy ask from patient advocacy groups, I think at least 1 decade. I think our first paper in Duchenne came something like 8-9 years ago, especially from groups that have high unmet need, like the Duchenne patient community. But it's not limited, I think, to the POs. And having this panel, it's obvious that we're all realizing its usefulness. We realize that real world data and big data, they hold a promise. They hold a promise that by using them properly, we can have better and safer treatments in the market. But if I can be a little provocative, I would say, we can have them faster, we can have them cheaper, and maybe more equitable and more accessible. But in order to do so, we need to streamline our efforts. And we need to have a frame where the use of this data, it can connect to the drug development process, from basic research to access, and not just to some regulatory steps. So, as you said, RTCs are the gold standard. That's for sure. But when we're talking for pediatrics, when we're talking rare diseases, we know the challenges that we're facing. We know, even from the last studies, that the pharmaceutical and medical device industry in EU and US determined that 27% of real-world studies conducted by industry have been requested by the regulatory authorities. So the request for real-world data and follow-up studies is increasing constantly. I saw in the last ASCO value frame analysis that the real-world survival estimates for cancer, specifically therapies, were 16% lower in RCTs, efficacy measurement, suggesting that the RCTs may overestimate the survival benefit of the anti-cancer agents. And we're not even touching the safety part. And I really don't want even to go to the pediatric cancers on this. So this difference can be due to the bias that the RCTs have, bias in observational studies, or genuine differences in the patient population. There are limitations. There is a selection bias. There is time limitation and how long you can collect and monitor, let's say, the development. The availability of generated data is limited, especially when we're talking for long-term monitoring. And we have struggled with this, even in the regulatory environment, how you can continuously collect. This is affecting HTA, this is affecting reimbursement, and at the end, it's affecting access. So access to populations with high unmet need. And if you move, let's say, this paradigm, and you try to apply it to rare diseases, pediatric cancer, especially that the extensive use of off-label use of drugs, it's the norm, then I think we can easily realize what are the challenges. But on the other hand, real-world data and let me say also real-world studies, they also have challenges. The accuracy, the reliability, the applicability of real-world data varies, the sources that we use, the types of data, the way that we capture this data, and obviously the analysis and the methodologies we use, because it's well known that if you torture enough the data, it will tell you anything you need, to find out. So even in the most sophisticated systems that we have now, and they can be a very good source of reliable data, like the electronic health records that we have in some, but not in all systems, critical elements are missing. We don't have, even in these records, consistency in data collection. And key variables can be missing, which will reduce clinical validity of this data. So the informed decision later on in the process, it will not be viable. So it creates these limitations and these challenges, they create uncertainty in the process and the way that we have to move forward. But I was thinking that uncertainty is part of our life or of our work. So we have two fantastic speakers, one from industry and a regulator. Uncertainty is something they do for a living. It's a trade. They have, as regulators, have to deal with the uncertainty, and uncertainty is in the DNA of drug development for the industry. For the patients, uncertainty is our life. we live with uncertainty. And real world data is useful because I can give you the example from Duchenne that for, I think, the last 30 years, we use corticosteroids as the standard of care. And we still do not know 40 years later, which is the best regime, which is the dose, and for which children to give. And real world data and real world evidence and big data can help us make this decision. So beyond the part of the development, also in the part of care. So patient engagement can be, and it is a solution, but I will say patient empowerment is even more important. Understanding the value of your data, why it's needed, the types of collection, connection, because we see that now we're talking about federated models, use and reuse of our data is key. And I would like to bring the example that we learned the painful way, let's say, from the Duchenne community. And it's a pity Elizabeth is not here because she pioneered this. But we work on data for more than 10, 15 years now. And something like 12 years before, we've come across the FAIR principles that we want to use findable, accessible, interchangeable, reusable. And we realized that this can be very useful for our data. And we heavily invested resources in this. And currently, we see that these models are used, for example, in our neuromuscular ERN, the registry hub that we're creating, and it's connecting the registries. It's FAIR by design. We have built applications, a hub. So we started with a patient locker. So people like me, other parents, can collect the data of the children and they can upload them. And then we realized that if you have all this data and patient-reported outcomes also inside, it can help you, because the first question, because not research, as you can understand, it was care. It can help you decide for your care. And with an artificial agent, it helped also to help you even improve this care, to have reminders, to make you smarter as a parent, but also as a community. But soon we realized that this can also be used for research. So by validating, by inviting to our Duchenne data platform, for example, the clinician or the regulator, and validate this data that I have uploaded for my son. This is clinical outcome, the moment he validates it. And this has a value for Peter, or it has a value for Martina for drug development. So there are ways that we can move forward, but we need to be very specific on how we can do this. And I don't have a feeling that we are discussing in 200 panels around initiatives about real data. But, then we need to build the next steps. How we can do it now, how we can do it in Europe, how we can do it for the benefit of our people and the system, and the healthcare system. Because time is a rare commodity in many of our patients. So a clear framework where each stakeholder has a role, a clear plan, harmonization of our efforts, and harmonization with the rest of the stakeholders. So what are we looking for, what we're collecting, which is the purpose, and who has access, as you said, in an ethical, efficient, and effective way. So 3 priorities and, 3 key messages maybe from our community is that we need education. We need education, obviously, in our communities, as patient advocacy communities, but maybe we need education to the broader public, because data is important, and we saw it in COVID, how important and how useful it could be to speed up the development and the effectiveness and the collection of real-world data afterwards. The second is that we need definitely a clear framework and a plan how we should move forward. And I think there are a lot of initiatives that are currently working on that. But maybe you are a policy officer, Kaisa, so maybe my last point will be in a policy level. We need a very constant, clear and constant policy direction, and these directions to lead to a harmonization of our efforts as patients, but also with the rest of the stakeholders. Thank you, Kaisa.
Thank you, Dimitrios. That was a very nice introduction that has already raised several questions that I've been noting down as you spoke. Not least the question of collaboration and partnership versus exploitation of patients' resources, because that's constantly an issue in the communities. I think it's probably the best if we take all the presentations and then open the floor for discussion. So I will introduce our second speaker, who will now take us to a different perspective. Martina van Meyenn, who leads the medical real-world data chapter at Roche, where she provides strategic expertise on the use of real-world data to support evidence generation across the whole company. Martina holds a master's degree in biotechnology and a PhD in systems biology. Martina, I know you are passionate about real-world data, and you will tell us how companies are using it now and what some of the challenges are to realize the value of this when it comes to actually improving patients' care. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kaisa, and thank you, Dimitrios, for a fabulous introduction and scene setting. I can certainly build on that. Yes, so I will attempt to give an industry perspective, and I perhaps want to start with something that is more of an historic view of how we've looked at data. And rest assured, it's not the focus of the presentation, but it's relevant to contextualize how pharmaceutical industry thinks about evidence generation. Evidence generation in the context of a life cycle of a drug comes in many phases. Obviously, the biggest need at the time of development, at the time of launching a medicine, where you're going to submit to regulators, where you're going to submit to HTAs. And then throughout the life cycle, it continues evidence generation needs that might be triggered by all sorts of things. New competitors entering, new formulations being available, conditional reviews being needed. Now, if you take that with a lens of real-world data, there's massive amounts of insights that we generate from it. To Dimitrios' point, we follow a strict fair guidance policy within Roche, certainly, and I know many other industry stakeholders do it as well, to try and harmonize the data that we have in-house and to also better link it to the data that exists internally. It will tell us about sort of how treatments are used in real life. How does that link to comparative effectiveness? That's obviously a key question that payers will have along the way. How's treatment sequencing best done in clinical practice? So these are pieces that historically we've been looking at that we're still considering, of course. But for the purpose of today, I'd like to focus on something slightly different. And some of those points have been touched upon already, which is mainly that we're seeing a shift from sort of large randomized control trials to a bit of a hybrid model, certainly now, and the sort of reliance on real-world insights and evidence is increasing. Now, if you look at oncology, for example, that's just one example where diagnostic tools are advancing rapidly. And that's not just diagnostic tools, it's also ways that we can capture data that increase to the amount of knowledge that we have. But at the same time, it makes it fairly complicated and complex to run traditional studies and to be able to prove concepts that are evolving. Now, if you take a more patient-centric view, how can big data or real data help advance care and shorten time to access to treatment? Again, so this is an industry point of view, but I'm hoping it's relevant to the patient community as well. 3 topics I briefly want to touch upon. One is the insights into and to inform clinical decision-making. Dimitrios touched on that briefly. I'll go into a bit more detail from our side. A second one being clinical trial concepts that are new, that require us to be more flexible, that bring greater needs from a real-world point of view, but are essentially shortening the time from R&D to the availability of a treatment. And then one topic that's sort of dear to my heart is more efficient trial recruitment. I think we can do much more on this to increase actually the actionability on many of the diagnostics that are available, and in matching patients to treatments that may not yet be available, but certainly getting access to care. So if we focus on clinical decision-making briefly, and this is a very rough patient journey, does not have all the specific pathways, but if we look at what we use real-world data for, and the importance here really is about transparency of data. I think we're finding ourselves in a way, and I've illustrated it just before, that we have very small patient population. That's not just true in oncology. Dimitrios touched on Duchenne's, obviously. There's many other rare diseases where it's important to have breadth of data, not product-specific data, but literally breadth of data that allows clinicians to look into the data and to come to their own conclusions. In the context of oncology, what does that mean? If you would be able to understand, first of all, when to use, for example, a next generation sequencing test or a broader panel, for example, wouldn't that be helpful to the diagnostic workup? Which clinical genomic factors are indicators of the best approach for that specific patients? What is the best treatment sequence that's most favorable? And most importantly, and if we mentioned that before as well, is the link to outcomes. And those outcomes actually reinforming the chain that I've just described, because without that feedback loop, it essentially stops and we don't take learnings from it. Now that's sort of the ideal scenarios. And I think we're making really good progress in that sense, but we're challenged with access to data, as been mentioned before. Small patient population that sort of emphasize or perhaps put a magnifying glass on the scrutiny of real-world data, the biases that you have in smaller populations, agreement on what is clinically relevant data to collect. And I just want to emphasize this one really quickly, because at the moment, for the most part, we rely on clinicians, registrars, nurses to enter data. Sometimes it is patients as well. But essentially, we're having them do this almost in their spare time. It's a massive undertaking to enter all of that. And we don't yet understand what are the variables that will lead to the most meaningful insights. And one thing that I think perhaps all of us have seen that have either moved cities, have moved countries, treatment journeys are not linear. Your patient records are not likely to travel with you. For me, certainly, I've moved from the UK to Switzerland. My patient's record stayed in the UK. I had to request them, transfer them on my own to Switzerland, and then make them available. So these are things that we're obviously facing when we look at big data. New trial concepts, and that's inherent to the sort of precision medicine piece that I described before. See us moving from what used to be a very traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 approach until you went to licensing to earlier lines. What that means, though, is bigger data commitments in conditional approvals. You need longitudinal data. And in many cases, we are still in a reactive state, I would describe it. That means for every new innovative medicine, we start data collection from scratch, because essentially, we're learning and we're starting from scratch, where it'd be perhaps a lot more efficient, but we're still figuring out ways to do this, to start broad, to be able to build on platforms that are scalable, and you can actually move from there rather than going retrospective each time and then again moving forward. And one topic, and that's my last topic that I wanted to touch on, is more efficient use of the data that's being generated for recruitment into trials. And we certainly, at Roche, we have several pilots, several trials looking into that, whether that's blockchain technology, whether that's looking to work with other companies. But essentially, what we're looking to face, the challenges are the same. But oftentimes you find that patients are receiving a genomic profile test or some sort of diagnostic workup. Clinicians will then determine what's best treatment for them. They'll also go through clinical trials that might be on offer. What hasn't happened efficiently is the connectivity of the data across departments, across referral centers, or even beyond referral centers. You can see patients might be tested twice, 3 times sometimes until they find the right one. Sometimes the information in, for example, a clinical report is only looked at for a specific subset of the trial that you're aware of, but you're sort of disregarding whatever else information is in there. And it would be fantastic if you could connect patient data better to increase the chance of matching therapy options. So you wouldn't have to go through the lengthy processes that are unfortunately still there. I think there's many things on the technology that could be said there, but just wanted to emphasize there's a lot of innovation happening in the space. And it also takes, I think, vocal patient groups can make a lot of just leave us with I guess, 2 calls to actions. Namely, first and foremost, you play a vital part in all aspects of big data, especially in ensuring the data is used in your best interest. I would also like to call out that the momentum currently is really good. You'll have, I guess, Peter Arlett speak to what is happening sort of on the European space, but there's lots of evolution happening from a technology side, from a HTA regulator and industry point of view, trying to think about ways to harmonize data and trying to access data and to create that. It's perhaps the best opportunity now to get involved, vocal, and influence, to make your voice heard is, I guess, what I'd like to leave us with. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina, for sharing your perspective with us. I think, again, there are questions arising from your talk, and there's already one in the chat. But before we go into that, we have a third perspective, and it's the last, but it's definitely not the least, because we have with us Peter Arlett, who's head of data analytics and methods Taskforce at EMA. Peter has a very long experience at EMA, having headed the major departments related to pharmacovigilance, epidemiology, and risk management for many years. And before that, he was at the European Commission in the pharmaceuticals unit. So he really knows the topic well. He's also qualified in medicine and holds several academic positions. So I think, Peter, you're going to give us the EMA perspective on real-world data and also a bit about patient engagement. Please, the floor is yours, Peter.
Thanks very much indeed. And thanks for the invitation. It's great to be both on the programme committee and participating in this session. So great to be able to follow on from Dimitrios and from Martina and give a regulator's perspective. A lot has been said before, but you know what they say, education, 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 or repetition is sometimes not a bad thing. But if I rush over certain parts, it's because I would be repeating or further emphasizing a point already made. So I'm going to give a regulator's perspective on potential of real-world evidence, real-world data and real-world evidence in medicines innovation. I was looking through the slides before I logged on, and I realized that I've been a little bit sloppy about use of terminology, and you will see real-world data, real-world evidence, and big data being used a little bit interchangeably. So when you see big data, I think for the sake of this talk, we're talking fundamentally about real-world data being then converted into real-world evidence. So forgive me for that looseness with terminology. Let's then, I won't go through the contents in the interest of time, but I'm going to give you a quick whiz through some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and then focus on what we're doing to make this a reality before concluding on some key messages. Now, this is a busy slide, but it is worth having a vision, because if you don't have a vision, you don't know where you're going. And there's a rather nice vision that comes from the big data Taskforce, and some of you will have seen the report of the Big Data Taskforce from the heads of medicines agencies and EMA, which was published in the beginning of 2020. By delivering the vision of a regulatory system able to integrate big data into its assessment and decision making, we can support the development of innovative medicines, deliver life-saving treatments to patients more quickly, and optimize the safe and effective use of medicines through measurement of a product's performance on the market. So that's our big vision. But actually, fundamentally, as a regulator, that's what we want to do, and we want to do it better. And this is all about continuous improvement. Now, the graphic in the middle of the slide essentially is outlining or reminding me to say that we believe there are use cases, concrete use cases for real-world evidence throughout the product lifecycle. And this somewhat overlaps with what Martina was saying with her examples. And I'm not going to give many specific examples in my presentation, but be it the prevalence of a rare disease for orphan designation, be it the feasibility of using real-world evidence in drug development at the Scientific Advice Working Party, be it the unmet medical need in children at the Pediatric Committee, be it contextualization of clinical trial results at the time of authorization, albeit studying the safety and effectiveness of medicines on the market through the various committees, including the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, we believe as long as we are thoughtful about the research questions and about the evidentiary value of real-world evidence in those different use cases, we believe it can play a role in all of them. Now, we also have done some work with our committees of looking at where the use cases are. And actually, it's quite interesting. If you go to each committee and you start listing the use case, it looks like a very long and diverse list, but you can actually aggregate them into 6 broad areas. And if we look at the columns at the bottom, the first column equates broadly to drug development. So support the planning and review of an applicant by that means a pharmaceutical company's studies. So we can use real-world evidence to design to inform on the design and feasibility of planned studies. We can also look at the representativeness and the validity of completed studies in drug development. Then if we start thinking about understanding clinical context, disease epidemiology tells us about the relevance of a clinical trial and the representativeness of the clinical trial population once a product might be then used on the market. And we can also look at clinical management and drug utilization. So what is the normal treatment pathway? So where would this new therapy fit in to existing therapy? Or where would this therapy that's causing a side effect that's just been detected, what other therapies could be used instead of it, for example? And then the final collection is looking at associations and impact. So looking at the association between exposure to a drug and a particular side effect or safety or effectiveness outcome, as well as looking at the impact of regulatory action. So what happened when we restricted the indication of a particular drug because of a new side effect, for example. These 6 areas we find quite helpful in terms of thinking about the way we might use real-world evidence. And actually, I was slightly misleading. The 3 columns are not drug development, authorization, and post-authorization. It's the planning of applicant studies, it's understanding clinical context, and its associations and impact. So sorry for having introduced that incorrectly. Let's move on to the next slide. So this slide, which people haven't so much focused on today, and I'm not going to read through the whole slide. I'm just going to give you some examples because this is, if you like, I think it's called traditional regulatory challenges. In a way, this equates to the use cases. And the left-hand side of the slide is the pre-authorization, the right-hand side of the post-authorization. But let's just have a look at the left-hand side, and this will all be very familiar to you. But these regulatory challenges essentially provide the opportunities for improvement from real-world evidence. So do we know what the unmet medical needs are? So where there's a priority for drug development? How generalizable are randomized controlled trials? Do they really tell us about the population with a particular disease? Is the clinical trial database big enough to assure us on the safety and the effectiveness or efficacy of the medicine? Can we use traditional drug development, I'm thinking particularly of randomized controlled trials, to look at the benefits and risks in special populations or high-risk populations? So I'll stop there, but you can see that, if you like, the limitations of clinical trials and traditional drug development point us to where real-world evidence has the potential to be most impactful for public health. Now, this slide, again, is slightly complex, forgive me, but there are some challenges of using big data, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think Dimitrios particularly, but also Martina touched on many of these. There are issues about the representativeness and the quality of the data source. Provenance is a word I'm hearing much more when we talk about real-world evidence. Do we know where the data come from, what has been done to it before it becomes evidence, if you like? Quality is an area where you'll hear people say it. Actually, often people use the word data quality in very different ways, and it's an area where we need to make sure that we're all talking the same language. And also, is a data source suitable to answer a particular question? That's particularly about the characteristics of the data. Does it collect the relevant exposure? Do we have information on weight and smoking that might be confounders, for example? Do we have long enough follow-up to look at longer-term outcomes? All these natures of the data are challenges and things we need to think carefully about when we're deciding whether to use real-world data, real-world evidence, and how to use it. The scientific methods have developed enormously over recent years, and I think we probably have scientific methods to deal with most of the challenges. The issue is about the quality of their applicability. There have been some very high-profile examples of studies published which have then turned out to be retracted, either because of the provenance of the data or because the methodologies were not robust, thinking particularly of things like immortal time bias, basically not quite designing it correctly to ensure that the study is accurately measuring what you want it to measure. So we think we've got the methods to do almost everything we want to do, but we need to make sure that they are applied robustly. And one of the issues about using real-world data is that if you have access to such data, there's no driving test, if you like, before you can do a study and put it into a scientific journal, other than the peer review of that journal. And so therefore, there is quite a variable quality in the methodologies used. Consistency, different results from different countries. Transparency, we need to really drive up transparency and particularly ensure that people are publishing their protocols in advance. So an a priori specification is the way it's worded in this slide. Now, given all of those opportunities in the previous slide and challenges in this slide, as has already been mentioned by previous speakers, the medicines regulatory community in Europe set up this big data task force, and it came up with 10 recommendations, which are represented in this rainbow. And we now are delivering on those recommendations. I see that time is nearly up. So what I want to do is just highlight that we are engaging very actively with patients. So if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, we believe there are, and these are just examples, but lots of areas for collaboration: patient-reported outcomes as real-world data, the whole area of data privacy. How can we turn data protection legislation into an enabler for research rather than, as it's often perceived, a barrier to research? How do we interface with patient organizations as research organizations? But also patient organizations can be data holders, thinking particularly of patient registries. The bottom right-hand side of this slide lists a number of ongoing collaborations between the medicines regulators and patient organizations, and I won't read through them. Some of them are well known to you, like the Patients and Consumers Working Party. Others you may not have known, but we have patient representatives on the Darwin EU Advisory Board, on the Big Data Steering Group, to name but two. If we then just go to the priorities for action, I'm not going to go through this, but this is basically a work plan, and we updated our work plan at the end of August on the real-world evidence, big data. And I think the thing to say is there's a lot going on. We're very ambitious in terms of realizing the potential of real-world evidence. And we can maybe go into the details of some of this during the Q&A. But there will be opportunities for patient engagement in all, well, maybe not the vet, but which is the bottom row, but in all of these rows and work streams. We want to make real that often said for patients, with patients, but on the real world evidence, we want to make sure that we've got patients at the table at every step of the way. If I then, I think, I was going to give an example on COVID, but I'm not, I think we haven't got the time. Maybe
you do, Peter, if you want to, it's okay.
Well, okay, so let's do it because it's a really nice example. New pandemic, high morbidity and mortality, spreading across the world, no demonstrated and certainly no authorized treatments, no available vaccines. How do we get to a situation with safe and effective vaccines and effective treatments very rapidly? And the answer is large clinical trials combined with real-world evidence and a multi-stakeholder approach. Let's just focus on the real-world evidence. We needed to understand the disease better. For example, blood clots with COVID is a really good example where we didn't really know until many months into the pandemic that there were associated high rates of blood clots. But that was important when we started rolling out the vaccines, for example. What are the background incidence rates of adverse events to give context to vaccine safety? What do we know about the databases that are out there? Do they collect data on vaccines and vaccination? Have the terms that are relevant to background incidence rates been validated? The data in the databases. What about the frequency of updating those databases? If they're only updated once a year, it's not very useful in a rapidly evolving pandemic. And availability of lab data might be highly relevant to some of the issues that we're looking at. So, I mean, I'm going quickly, but what we did is basically a huge amount. We put out guidance on real world evidence in the context of COVID-19. We set up a kind of stand-up, for those of you who are familiar with how it works with agile IT delivery, we had a stand-up meeting at 9 o'clock every morning to look at what was being published, to look at what we were being sent by regulators around the world, academia and industry. I'm talking specifically about real-world evidence now, so that we could decipher what was impactful for decision-making, what might lead to authorization of a medicine or restriction or a new safety label. This was a daily occurrence. We set up vaccine safety studies. And if you look at the bottom, it's just a visual of the safety studies. We basically set up a preparatory vaccine safety framework in the middle of 2020, which we called Access. And then at the end of 2020, kicking off in 2021, we had both a prospective study on vaccine safety data collection, as well as then leveraging in a more classic secondary use of healthcare data, the data both on incidence rates to contextualize vaccine safety, but then also to evaluate specific safety issues. And this was absolutely critical when we had, for example, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia with the AstraZeneca vaccine, also myocarditis with the messenger RNA vaccines. The fact that we put in place these real-world evidence or real-world data networks and real-world evidence studies prospectively meant that we could evaluate things very, very quickly. And all of that work is now ongoing. So what I put to you, and I haven't gone through all the use cases in the context of the pandemic, is that real-world evidence had a major positive public health impact. And if we get it right, work in a multi-stakeholder way, we're cognizant of the limitations of the data and choose the data and the methodologies carefully, we can deliver impactful evidence to facilitate the authorization and supervision of medicines. So I think then my key messages, in no particular order, we believe regulation will become more data-driven, and that includes real-world evidence. We believe better evidence through real-world evidence, will support better decisions for medicines for patients. We believe the best way to deliver this is in a collaborative way with a role for all stakeholders. And you heard me say it earlier, patient-focused in everything we do. So thanks very much. I just want to actually highlight that very last bit of text on the slide. It's a very ambitious, this is a goal more than a vision, because the vision was at the beginning about better regulatory decision-making. Our goal for the next couple of years is that by 2025, the use of real-world evidence will have been enabled and the value will have been established across the spectrum of regulatory use cases. I'll leave it there, Kasia, and forgive me for overrunning by 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think the extra moments were well worth it, especially that last example was really interesting. I think you have about 3-4 years to reach that goal, by the way. It's not a very long time.
It's not a long time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we have some time for questions and answers. Interaction with the audience. I already see a couple of questions appearing in the chat. So I will take them, I think, first to give the audience questions their due. So there is one question for Martina. How can trial recruitment become more efficient? What are the hopes with decentralized clinical trials and also many recruiting platforms on the market today?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I've tried to highlight some of it. Trial recruitment becoming more efficient. I think there's a mixture, and it probably depends on the disease area you're looking at. If you just look at it from a data point of view, I think the connectivity across hospitals, moving to a more digitized environment, lots of it still tends to be in paper records sometimes, would help. So I've mentioned the example of genomic reports that are being used but are not fully screened to some extent. They may not be shared across every site. These are examples where I think it would be relatively easy to shorten those times. Decentralized trials, certainly that's something that we're also exploring, getting trials closer to where patients are rather than having patients come into the clinics for everything. These are all, I think, concepts that are still sort of in trial mode, if you so want. It's worth to see which of those are most effective. At this point, I don't think there is the single most true answer. I don't think we're at that point yet. But it's important to keep those innovation pieces on the radar in order to learn for them. In terms of recruiting platforms on the market, you're right. It's even when you access data, there's a whole range of offers that are available. And trying to figure out which one is the best one, again, we're all learning as we go. We're certainly piloting a few of them to see what's best placed. Sometimes that depends on the geography. So some have a footprint in a certain region versus others that don't have that specific footprint. That's one aspect to it. Others will have certain types of data or certain hospital data that others won't have. So it's a mixture of things. I'm afraid there's no clear answer on this just yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is another question here, and that is for Peter. From your point of view, what is the top priority out of the 10 recommendations that you showed?
So as a regulator, we like people to comply, but I'm going to be non-compliant with the question. And I'm going to give 3. So I think one thing I would say is I'm going to be a Nike man now and say, just do it. You know, we can talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, but I think we need to do it. And we need to deliver real world evidence into decision making with our eyes open about strengths and weaknesses. In order to do it, we need to access data. So the number one recommendation from the big ticket recommendation from the big data task force was Darwin EU. So this federated Europe-wide network. And I'm pleased to say we're on track to establish the coordination center starting from January. We're going through a big procurement exercise at the moment. And we think we found long-term funding and therefore sustainability for that. So that's really important, and we believe should, if done well, be transformational over the next few years. We then need to think about the use cases and the processes, because there's no point in having the availability of real-world evidence if we're not feeding logical questions coming out of the committees. And some of you will have seen that we've promised to be delivering across the different committees, be it the CHMP, be it the PRAC, be it the paediatrics, be it the orphans, but also delivering for the member states, also potentially delivering for HTA and payers, so the downstream decision makers as well. So that whole change management process bit is critical. And there are lots of forces of conservatism in the system. You know, regulators, for example, are kind of born conservative. That's with a little c, not a big C. You know, and they are risk averse and so on. And this is about change, and change brings risks with it. The last thing I would say is we need to demonstrate benefits. We need to demonstrate benefits for all stakeholders, but fundamentally, has real-world evidence been impactful in terms of regulatory decision-making that then leads to earlier authorization of a medicine or safer and more effective use of a medicine? And actually, the COVID example, I didn't elaborate it as well as I would have liked to have, but it's very concrete. We were able to evaluate safety more quickly and more robustly because we had really good real-world evidence studies in play. So that would be my 3, Kasia.
3 is very good. I like 3s. Maybe there is one question actually about Darwin and how it links to the European Health Data Space, but we will have another session dedicated entirely to the European Health Data Space. So maybe I'll park that and you can also attend that session and find out more there. There is one question that is for all of you, actually. So I would like to see if you have views on this. Here is it. I see real value in developing a united patient real-world evidence standards across disease areas that are not traditionally clinical valued, but patient valued. Could you comment on the feasibility and opportunity or challenges this would create? So I understand the standards for real-world evidence across disease areas that focus on what's important for patients, if I understood the question correctly.
Who do you want to go first, Kaisa?
Maybe Dimitrios.
Sure. I think this is a very good concept, but at least in our condition, we have learned to be very realistic. I think this is something that first we need to walk and then to run. Definitely, we can turn this data collection and real-world evidence patient-centered and patient-focused, and I think this is how it should be. But I think we have a lot of steps to do before. And maybe before I pass the talking sticks to my panelists, let's say my dear panelists here, I would like to also ask two questions to them. Sorry, Peter and Martina, for popping up like that. Peter, I know the amazing work you try to do for data. And I know that EPF is heavily investing resources on that. But do you believe that we have in EMA the adequate resources and time and people to push really the ball forward fast? And Martina, do you think that the rest of, let's say, the other companies, industry, are as open-minded as you? Because we have noticed a lot of sharing, not being caring from that side, let's say, of the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Always the patient is welcome to challenge everybody else. So would you like to respond, Peter, first, maybe?
Yes. Do you want me to touch on the standards one first, and then maybe go on to the more direct question from Dimitrios? So I think the one on standards is really interesting. It's easier to answer if we think about real world. Well, you can answer it about real world data and you can answer it about real world evidence. I think in terms of real world data, we were recently in meetings with the European organizations that cover general practitioners, and their number one thing on real world data, real world evidence was harmonization and data quality standards and driving up the quality and the way the data are collected. And I think there is a lot of work to be done there. It's really heavy lifting. I mean, really heavy lifting. So I think we need to see it as a long-term goal. It's multi-layered between, but if we then focus on the patient part of the question, this whole area of patient-reported outcomes, and that term means different things to different people. But if I'm thinking about it in terms of apps and smartphones and so on, well, maybe for that part, that's where the patient leadership should be coming, and maybe the patient should be telling to the providers, this is what we think is a minimum standard. I mean, I'm thinking on my feet here. The issue about real-world evidence standards is, I think, not about one standard, because I think evidence is use case specific, disease specific. So what is good enough for disease contextualization may be different from what is necessary in terms of a study that says that a drug causes an adverse reaction, for example. It's a different evidentiary value. Then going specifically on to Dimitrios's question, I'm not going to give a yes or no answer. I'll give a more nuanced answer. So we have in the in the new legal proposal that's going through the Council and the Parliament on health union, which we understand is very close to finalisation and therefore adoption. real-world data and real-world evidence for the first time ever in the regulatory framework gets an explicit legal basis, obviously in the context of emergencies, but it's actually a really important legal basis. It also gets some funding. So there are there's some financial funding for the next few years, both for vaccines, but also for therapeutics. And there's also some headcount. It's modest, but if we use that headcount wisely, that will be an enabler, I would say. The other thing to mention, and it's really important, is that we understand the European Commission in its revision of the EMA fee regulation is foreseeing funding for real-world evidence linked to annual fees for pharmacovigilance, which is extremely logical because it spreads the cost of real-world evidence across all companies in the European Union. So a little cost to everyone to give a big delivery of real-world evidence and better decision-making. So we just hope that that is delivered because that's the long-term sustainability bit. That was a very direct answer, Dimitrios. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Martina, would you like to comment?
Yes, and I'll make it brief, just looking at the time. In terms of real-world evidence standards for patient-relevant outcomes, I am entirely with you. I think for us as a company, that's certainly something that we're looking to collect. I know other pharmaceutical companies do as well. Sometimes the challenge with real-world evidence, it's a bit chicken and eggs. It's not technically something that is standardized in routine clinical practice, hence tends to be collected in clinical trials, fairly standardized, but in the real world, it's hard to match. Or you're having to do dedicated studies, if you so want, which again is not really reflecting what I think is referred to in this context. So I think there is real value to push this, and then perhaps also a bit of a challenge to Peter. I can actually see value across disease areas. Now, there's a nuance, obviously, if you're comparing really pieces that are far apart. But if we are truly ambitious in sort of precision medicine, where you see concepts evolving beyond what we used to define diseases as, for example, breast cancer or colorectal cancer, if you limit it to those specific ones, I think we're missing the bigger picture. And we perhaps need pieces where we are able to look at things as a whole, because data otherwise will be so minimal that it's hard to draw conclusions from the very few patients that we're able to capture in this. In regards to industry attitudes, I cannot speak for all as much as I'd like to. I can tell you that from a European level, so FPA, that's sort of the group of pharmaceutical industries, there are various efforts ongoing that are looking at a patient-centered view on things. Now, as we all know, we're in a bit of an evolution of all of this. And that's why I've tried to show in the beginning the very drug-focused view, but it's moving, and I think we see some of it. It's probably a way to go. And that's why I think it's really important to have the voice quite vocal and use it. So would encourage you to continue to do this. Hopefully that helps a bit.
Thank you. Thank you. I see we are running out of time, and I wanted to ask you so many more questions, including one very important one about trust, because real-world data involves secondary use of people's health data. And I don't think I have time to go into that because we really have to wrap up the session. But maybe if you have any final words you'd like to share with our audience, you could do so, but please keep it short and sweet. And no doubt this is a topic that we will be returning to. This is not the last conversation we'll have. So can we start with, maybe we'll leave Dimitrios and his powerful words last. So Peter, is there anything you would like to add to what you said? What would you like to?
I've probably spoken too much already, but we are committed. Leveraging real-world data and evidence is a top priority for the European regulatory network, and we're committed to doing it with patients.
Thank you. Martina?
Yes, thank you. And I had my call to action already, so I'm not sure I need to repeat this in this instance, but really thrilled to see the ambition, Peter, from the European side, and Darwin especially, and same from an industry point of view. Patient involvement is becoming super relevant in core to what we do. Thank you. Last word to Dimitrios.
Thank you. I'm not the most vocal one, so I think Peter is doing my job very well. Thank you, Peter. The last word, I think, is we have a momentum. So although we were screaming and shouting the last couple of years about the patient data, I think now we have a momentum, and I think that at the policy level, somebody's hearing. So now we have to do the final push. And I think we should do it all together. So that's at least my take from this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you to all the speakers and the audience. This will continue. So we hope to see you again in another context. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.